We are taking you straight into the heart of English witch trials in this episode, into an ancient city cradled by Roman walls, where neighbors hid boxes of toads under beds, a tormented boy was haunted by a pig in a hat, and a royal physician dissected a familiar spirit just to make the king laugh over dinner. Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Let's visit the alleyways and courtrooms of early modern Devon alongside Professor Mark Stoyle, expert of early modern history at the University of Southampton and author of a great book, Witchcraft Exeter.
And Professor Stoyle's newest book, The Western Rising of 1549, is available now. You can buy both of these wonderful books at our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhunts, and that supports the podcast. Inside these city gates, witch trials weren't explosive mass panics. They were a slow, steady simmer of urban rivalries, bottom-up accusations, and surprising judicial pushback.
A century of preserved local ledgers are waiting for researchers like Professor Stoyle to explore why judges sometimes banished witches instead of hanging them, how scolding tied into witchcraft, and how a single clerk's notation in 1685 could prove England's supposed last executed witch actually survived. Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, Mark Stoyle. Please tell us about your work and expertise.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on. So I am the Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Southampton, and I work on a variety of different Tudor and Stuart subjects here in England. So I'm particularly interested in Tudor rebellions, popular rebellions in the Tudor period, the history of the English Civil War, and the history of witchcraft. And obviously, in some ways, those three subjects kind of interlink as well, but those are my three main research interests.
Today, we're going to discuss witch trials in Exeter. Where is Exeter and what do we need to know about it?
Well, I think the crucial things to let you know about Exeter is it's an ancient city. So it was founded by the Romans, and it's actually the regional capital of the southwest of England, and it has been since Roman times. So in the period that we're talking about today, the sort of Tudor and Stuart period, it was one of the biggest cities in England, certainly in the top 10. Some people would argue in the top 5 or 6. So at the time, it was really important. Today, it's a much smaller city compared with lots of other English cities. It's still the regional capital of the Southwest, though, and it's the city that's always been my home. So I'm particularly fond of it.
That's wonderful. I've really been enjoying reading through your Witchcraft Exeter volume.
Thank you.
The way it opens, talking about the history of how it came to get its own court, that was very informative. And I was wondering, is there anything like that or anything else about Exeter's history we need to understand when we go to look at the witch trial history?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things that I could talk about, but I think one interesting point to make is that the city was surrounded by defensive walls, and they were actually built in the Roman period. So those Roman walls still cradle the city today, and that was true in the Tudor and Stuart period. Essentially, a lot of the richest people in Exeter used to live in the centre, within the city walls, around the sort of central area of the town. There were lots and lots of poorer people, of course, in the city. They tended to live on the edges, sort of tucked up against the city walls, and particularly during the Tudor and Stuart period, outside. So there are some really big suburban areas already by the Elizabethan period, and the biggest, the most disorderly, and the most populous of those is a parish called St Sidwell's. And a disproportionate number of the Exeter witches are actually poor and elderly people who come from those suburban parishes. So the sort of the topography of the city as well is also something to bear in mind when we're discussing this subject.
When did witch trials occur in Exeter?
It's a complicated answer to that question. So, we first hear of alleged witches in Exeter as early as the 1300s. So there are isolated cases of witchcraft going all the way back to that period. But the first time that we really start to get clear glimpses of them is in the consistory court records of the local bishop. So Exeter had its own bishop. There's a cathedral. The Bishop of Exeter was in charge of the diocese. And during the period before the Reformation, it was particularly the church courts that dealt with witchcraft cases. And as I'm sure that you two guys are perfectly aware, they tended to give quite lenient sentences. So we know quite a lot about witchcraft in Exeter before the mid-Tudor period, but the period that interests me most really is the one that kicks off from the reign of Elizabeth I and Henry VIII onwards, the early to middle years of the 1500s. During the 1530s, Henry VIII makes Exeter a county in its own right. So Exeter has always sat within the county of Devon, and it's always been the capital of Devon. But because it was such a big and important city, Henry gives it this incredible privilege of being a little county in its own right. And as a result of that, the town governors, the mayor and the aldermen, the sort of the bigwigs who govern the city, they are also made justices of the peace. So they now have the right to try all sorts of felonies, to actually sit as justices on those cases. And Henry also gives them their own prison and the right to set up their own gallows at which they can execute offenders. And this happens just 30 years before Elizabeth I passes the act, or her parliament rather, passes the act which makes witchcraft in England a felony and can actually be a capital crime that people can be condemned to death for. And so now you have the Exeter Justice of the Peace, they've got their own Quarter Sessions Court, and they also have the authority to try, and if they find them guilty, to execute witches. So it's that collection of records that I've been particularly interested in over the last 10 years.
And when you look at the timeline of the trials, as the political landscape changes and there's lots of influences to the society, there are different trials with different outcomes, but there's never a major hunt. Is that correct?
No, that's absolutely right. So what's interesting about the story of what's going on in Exeter, there's a constant trickle of witch cases. So we've always had them in the consistory courts, and that goes on right through the later Tudor and Stuart period as well. But in the secular court, the Quarter Sessions Court, you get this trickle of witchcraft cases running all the way through from the 1560s up to the 1660s, but there is never an actual hunt. And although there are more of these cases in the 1650s than at any other time, even that doesn't really constitute a hunt. So it's a very interesting pattern of prosecutions. And it reminds me very much of what Alison Rowland found working on one of her German cities, that again, there's this sort of pattern of a number of trials, but never really taking off into what we could call a hunt. And, I wonder if this pattern is actually much more typical than the sort of the witch hunt pattern that people tend to think of, for example, with Matthew Hopkins.
Right. We know even from New England, it was one person at a time, two people at a time. And Salem was very unusual.
Exactly.
So.
And that's just the same in Exeter. There's just this one decade, the 1640s and 1650s, where you see a few more cases, but most of the time it's quite intermittent, really.
How many witch trials occurred in Exeter, and do we know how many people were formally accused of witchcraft and sentenced to die?
I mean, we do. This is what I've been working on over the last 10 years. And essentially, there's a huge quantity of records there that haven't really been trawled through in detail. And I've been doing that over the last decade. It's taken me quite a long time. But essentially, I've looked at about 100 years worth of records in depth. And within that time, there's about 30 different people who are actually formally accused of being witches. There are a number of other people who are accused of being witches, or their neighbours claim they're witches, but they're not actually brought to trial. But there are about 30 individuals who are actually brought to trial in that 100-year or so period. And of those, several are tried on several occasions. So, they escape once, if you like, but in several cases, they're then tried again and actually found guilty and condemned to death.
What kind of records do you get to look through?
Well, I mean, the records that particularly interest me are the Quarter Sessions Court records. And so essentially there are two kinds of record. There are the books of the court books that kind of record what was done at each sessions. And they record the list of interrogatories. That's the depositions that people made when they were being questioned about witch cases. So those survived from about 1610 onwards, 1650 and onwards. But before that, we also have the Quarter Sessions rolls. And these were the formal lists of indictments that were drawn up at each of the sessions. So the Quarter Sessions, I don't know if you guys have these in the States, but these were held 4 times a year. And so this is when all the justices of Exeter would meet together in the Guildhall, which is the civic building at the centre of the city. And in those 4 quarter sessions courts, they would try all sorts of felonies which had taken place in the city over that time. And within those, there is this small trickle of witch cases that come up every now and again.
You had mentioned that Parliament passed a law to make witchcraft a felony. What is the significance of that act?
This is the first time that witchcraft was tried by the secular law in England rather than by the church courts. I mean, to be honest, the situation is a bit more complicated than that. Henry VIII himself had brought in an act against witchcraft during his reign, but as far as we know, that act was never put into practice. We haven't got any evidence of witches being prosecuted under it. So it's actually this act of Elizabeth I, his daughter, in 1563. This is the one that not only makes witchcraft a secular crime and thus a felony punishable by death, but also seems to have sort of kick-started this whole series of prosecutions which take place in many parts of England thereafter. So it's that act that really opens the floodgates to all of the secular witch trials that take place in England over the next 120 years.
And it was a statute against conjurings, enchantments, and witchcraft. Does that encompass the work of cunning folk?
It does, although I'm sure that you'll have seen there's a young British scholar called Tabitha Stanmore who's recently brought out a new book about cunning men, or two new books, in fact. And she makes the very interesting point that although the statute does effectively cover all sorts of magic and witchcraft, it was actually very rare for cunning men and women to be prosecuted. But interestingly, I have found a few examples in Exeter of where that does happen. So it tends to be that the Witchcraft Act is primarily used against those who are accused of black magic, of actually wasting and destroying either people or animals through black magic. And obviously, usually that doesn't actually sort of pull in cunning men and women unless they're suspected of using both types of magic, if you like.
Were sentences other than death ever enforced?
Yes. So one of the really interesting things that I've found about what's going on in Exeter is that even before this secular act was brought in 1563, there were already people in Exeter who were being accused of being witches during Queen Mary's reign and during the very early years of Elizabeth's. And at that time, what the city magistrates would do was to banish those who are accused of being witches. Now, again, that's obviously a horrible punishment. It means that you're cast out from your home, you're cast out from your friends and relatives, and you have to try and find a new way to live somewhere else. So, it's not a minor punishment, but obviously it's much better than death itself. And what I found particularly interesting is that after this new law is passed in 1563, on several occasions, the city councillors still decide to banish people who've been condemned of witchcraft rather than to execute them. And that suggests to me that initially, at least, there's some resistance to this act, that some local governors may have felt, well, this is really extreme to actually hang people that in the past we've been accustomed to simply sending out of the city. So there's an interesting angle there that by no means all local governors were keen to execute witches. In fact, if anything, some of them seem to have pushed back against that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that because when, a lot of us think of witch hunters and Salem, and again, a lot of people were having a better experience than that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is what's so interesting, that we have, all of us, I think, have a tendency to see witches being prosecuted by these sort of malicious figures in authority, people like Matthew Hopkins, sort of witch hunting magistrates. And obviously people like that did exist, but there were also a lot of other people who didn't initially want to prosecute or were skeptical or just were worried that perhaps these punishments were too harsh, when we considered that for centuries, church courts have been handing out much lighter penalties for supposed witches. So I think it takes a while for English local governors perhaps to get into the mindset of this is now what's happening to witches. And the other point which I'd like to make is that once this act has been passed in 1563, it's not just a sort of top-down process of magistrates actively looking for witches to prosecute. What tends to happen is it's ordinary people actually denouncing their neighbours and then trying to pressure the magistrates to act. So there's a kind of bottom-up pressure as well. And I actually think in the majority of English witch hunting cases, that pressure is probably greater than the pressure from above.
Right. We've seen it takes that bottom up and the top down because you need some buy in, even in the situations where the bottom up is stronger.
Yeah.
You definitely need the buy in from above to proceed.
Definitely. And I mean, my suspicion is, although it's hard to prove, that in this long period that we're talking about 120 years, there were some Exeter magistrates who were keen to prosecute. And indeed, I can think of one or two we might come back to in a moment. I can think of one particular case where someone does seem to have been very keen to prosecute. But I do wonder if the majority attitude was, this is difficult, it's nasty, it's not easy to prove, it creates a lot of tension in the city. My gut feeling is that the majority of Exeter's local governors at this time were not keen to push for witchcraft prosecutions, and that they certainly weren't initiating them, although some were quite prepared to follow up on these denunciations when they were made.
What was the prosecution culture like at that time? Did they seem to be getting people for everything they could,
Well,
get them on, or was it mild?
Well, I mean, it's a very, very different culture to ours. And there's no doubt that early modern Exeter was a very rigorously policed city. One of the things that I find particularly interesting about its story is that at the beginning of the Reformation, the southwest of England was a very, very conservative area. It actually clung on to Catholic religious practice for as long as it could. And my most recent book is actually about the Western Rising in 1549, which was a huge popular uprising by the people of Devon and Cornwall against the religious changes that were being brought in by Edward VI. So this is a very conservative area right up until about 1550, but gradually zealous Protestantism, Puritanism gradually starts to take more and more of a hold, particularly in Devon. And Exeter is an interesting example of that Puritanism becomes quite established quite early. The Puritans are determined to turn Exeter into a godly city on a hill. And by 1620s, Exeter is really in the grip of a Puritan oligarchy, which is determined to police it in a really tough way. So very, very minor infractions, they seem so to us, could be really harshly punished. So during the 1620s, you could be punished for swearing, you could be punished for being drunk in public, you could obviously be harshly punished for adultery or having children out of wedlock. But even, really to us trivial things like selling radishes in a street on a Sunday, you could be punished for that. And there was a whole panoply of instruments of punishment. There were the stocks. People could be tied to a post and whipped. There was a workhouse. There were prisons. So, yeah, I mean, it was a pretty tough society. And there are lots and lots of penalties laid out on people for all of those sorts of infractions. But within that, as I say, witchcraft is a very small stream within that. And there's a very small number of people being accused of this compared with drunkenness, debauchery, swearing, those sorts of crimes.
How often were people acquitted of witchcraft?
Well, again, so interesting. In the great majority of Exeter cases, they were. So if we're talking about 30 cases, perhaps, or 30 individuals who were brought before the court in that 120-year period, of those, as far as we know, only 4 were actually condemned to death and executed. And several others were condemned to death, but actually reprieved at the last minute. So you're talking about a hit rate there of perhaps only 1/5 of those who are accused are actually executed. So again, it's much more moderate than we might perhaps expect.
We'd love to hear some of these stories. What kind of complaints of witchcraft were being made, and what were these cases like?
Okay, well, there's a sort of variety of different complaints being made, but the majority of them are really to do with, obviously, black magic, often harming animals. So there are lots of cases in Exeter where people claim that their cows, their pigs, their horses have been attacked by witchcraft, and many of them killed. The most serious cases of all, of course, are when people are actually said to have been killed. And there are several cases where people accuse witches of having killed members of their family or friends. And there's one particularly sad case where an Exeter weaver claims that all of the members of his family were killed by a single witch. So those are the worst cases. But there are other things as well. It's quite common for them to claim that foodstuffs have gone wrong as a result of a witch's intervention, so that butter won't churn, that beer won't brew properly. There's a really interesting case where a young apothecary claims that having been bewitched by a local woman, he can't make his medicines work anymore, that his sort of brews don't work in the same way that they used to. And the other really interesting thing that we begin to see, there's not huge amount of evidence about this, but there is some. This is the idea of the witches actually keeping familiar spirits, demons in the shape of small animals, which they use to work their nefarious purposes. So those are probably the main four things that crop up in the Exeter records.
Yeah, reading to prepare for this, we came across toads again and again specifically.
Yeah.
What's the situation? Why were there so many toads?
Well, I mean, there's always been this connection, this idea that certainly in England, that witches have this association with toads. And some of the earliest pictures of English witches from the pamphlets that were published in this time, there's a really good example of one showing 3 witches hanging and another one underneath with her toad familiars. So the concept of the devil, or a small devil, if you like, or a demon, appearing to a witch and then taking on the form of a toad is quite common. So those stories, you'll find them across the whole of England, but they seem to be particularly common in the southwest, in Devon and Somerset. And again in this period, we see these references to witches being associated with toads, people denouncing their neighbours for having a box of toads under their beds. Someone actually denounces a neighbour because he burst in on her one night and found her sitting by the fire with a toad in her lap. And that connection between toads and witches is in Exeter right back from the earliest cases that I've looked at, right up to the Victorian period, where a teenage prostitute accuses another of being a witch and having a toad familiar. So it's a very deeply embedded trope here in the West Country.
That's really fascinating. We love it. Sadly, Minister Burroughs, who was hanged in 1692 in Salem, they got him to confess that he did seem to have a lot of toads around his yard. So that really jumped out at us. Reading this, we're like, oh, the origin of the toad. So.
Yeah. A lot of those beliefs are carried across the Atlantic by the early settlers, and there's no doubt this connection between toads and witchcraft is a sort of a constant in English belief. There's a really fascinating story. I don't know if you two guys have come across it, but one of the things I'm interested in is the sort of the different attitudes of monarchs towards witch cases. Obviously, James I is initially a great witch hunter, but then becomes much more skeptical. His son, Charles I, seems to have been really skeptical about witches as well. And interestingly, his physician was a man called William Harvey. I don't know if you come across him, but he was a very advanced scientist for his time. And he was actually the man who realized that the blood circulates around the body. He was the first person to realize this. Very suspicious of witchcraft. And there's a great story that one day he encountered an alleged witch who had a toad, which she claimed was her familiar spirit. He kind of made friends with her, sent her out to get some drinks. And while she was gone, he pounced on the toad, cut it up with his scalpel, and discovered that it was just a normal toad. And the witch, obviously, when she came back, was furious and berated him for this, but he was very amused, and he used this as proof that witchcraft doesn't in fact exist. And we're told that when he went back to the palace, he shared that story with Charles I, and they laughed about it over dinner, which is really interesting, because I think here you can see how these advanced scientific ideas are beginning to create an atmosphere of skepticism at the top.
Wow, what a marvelous story. And how, but she lost her little pal too.
Yes. Harvey said that, the alleged sorceress attacked him furiously when she got back, she saw what he'd done to her toad.
I was wondering, I didn't really see a devil's book or a devil's pact discussed too much out of the records. The familiar was a mark that, there's devilish work being done here, but they weren't so concerned about a devil conspiracy with a pack of witches.
No,
pacts.
It's very interesting that idea of someone actually making a pact with the devil, that doesn't crop up in Exeter till much later. I think the first time that we see a clear reference to that is actually in the 1650s, which is after the Hopkins trials, which of course had made those ideas circulate much more widely. So this seems to be a more kind of traditional belief in the idea of the witch with a small demon or devil which can assume animal form and then assist her. But there are some great stories about this from the Exeter records. There is a woman who becomes terrified that a rat that she's seen in her house is in fact a familiar spirit that the witch has sent to haunt her. There's some great stories as well about people finding toads in their houses or in their baby's crib and being terrified that these are devils that the witch has sent to cause them harm, and of these toads being thrust onto a fire and burnt in an attempt to kind of destroy their power. And there's a really interesting story as well about another familiar. I think we were going to talk about some of the individual cases, and one of the very last cases in the sequence has some very strange stories about a possible familiar, but we can come on to that a bit later on.
Yeah. You're welcome to tell us about that right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you're sure, I mean, this is one of the very last cases in Exeter. So we see this series of cases going on right up until the 1660s. And then there's a whole sort of little glut of cases in that decade. And then they seem to stop. And the last one in the series is one of the most fantastical of all. And this is where a young boy, and I know that you two are interested in how children become involved in this, a young boy is walking in the street in St. Sidwell's one day, which is this parish, which I say is very disorderly and seems to have a particularly large number of alleged witches living within it. He throws a stone at another boy. It misses, and it hits a very elderly, poor woman who lived in one of the almshouses in St. Sidwell's, hits her by mistake. She's angry, of course. She comes out, she curses at him, she threatens him with a stick, and she says that she will be revenged upon him. And this seems to have actually turned his mind. He abandoned his place at work. He went back to his mum and dad's house, who lived in another parish, and he began to see things. And one day he's at church with his parents. He comes out and he claims to have been accosted by something in the shape of a black pig, which holds up its trotters to him and bids him to drown himself. And he rushes off and tries to drown himself in the River Exe, which is the big Exe, the river that flows along beside the city and gives it its name. He's rescued by neighbours and brought back to his mum and dad's house. But a few weeks later, we're told that he's crawling through the fields nearby. And this seems to have been because he believed himself to have been crippled by the witch's curse. And again, he's confronted by this black pig or something in the shape of a pig, this time, oddly enough, wearing a hat. But again, the pig tells him to drown himself. And again, he tries to throw himself into a lake, but he's saved by his neighbours. And shortly after that, the boy's parents bring him to the Guildhall in the centre of the city, and they accuse this woman, a certain Margaret Clark, of having bewitched him. And other people come forward as well to claim that Clark is a witch, and she's actually tried. The jury believe there is a case to be heard, and so she's put on her trial for her life as a witch, but she's actually cleared, and she's allowed to go home to St. Sidwell's. She dies there a year afterwards. I do wonder if it's part as a result of the treatment she'd received. But whatever, the court decides that she is innocent. And this is one of the most bizarre cases to occur in Exeter during the whole period. And it's also, you'll notice, it's on the testimony of a child. And after that, we see no more cases of witches being indicted in the Exeter Sessions records. And I do wonder if that's just because the judges thought, well, you know, this story was made up by a troubled boy, and perhaps, you know, we shouldn't have been taken in by this. And obviously there are broader tides of skepticism beginning to sort of spread around the country as a whole by this time. So that's a really interesting case, but a very unusual one as well. And it does seem to sort of herald the end of, I don't know, the beginning of real judicial skepticism in Exeter.
Were children involved in that way in many of the Exeter cases?
Some of the cases, I mean, one of the things that's really sad that you see again and again is cases where people believe that their children have been bewitched and killed by witches. So there are a number of cases of children being brought forward as victims, but we don't usually have such great testimonies actually from a child witness as we do in the case of Stephen Spark, who's the boy who believed that he'd been bewitched by Margaret Clark. So it's normally more these sad stories of children who have been bewitched. But there are several testimonies of other sort of young witnesses to witchcraft.
And would, like the story of Spark and Clark, would that have ever passed word of mouth or been covered in a pamphlet, or has that story been buried in the record?
Oh, that story had been completely buried. I think very few scholars have come across it. I think it's possible. I don't know if you come across the excellent work of Peter Elmer, So Peter's a foremost scholar of English witchcraft, and like me, he's looked carefully at those records, and I'm sure that he would have come across that case. And he's talked about some of the other Exeter cases in his book on politics and religion and witchcraft in this period. But no, I think Margaret Clark's story had been completely forgotten locally until I recovered it, and I found lots of documents relating to it that I don't think anyone had found before. I also know, I think, the very almshouse that she lived in, which is still there, which is really exciting.
That's amazing.
So, and I mean, my own dad grew up in St. Sidwell's, so I feel this incredible connection with that area and what was going on there. It's a fascinating part of the city.
Josh, you have those connections. You feel those connections because of your heritage.
I do. In particular, in relation to Exeter, I have ancestors from Bideford.
Oh, do you?
And I know that there were some cases from Bideford.
Yeah. That's so interesting, because this was the one thing that I was going to mention to you guys, because there is a further sort of complicating factor here. Tell me if this is getting too complex. But because Exeter is the county town of Devon, it had always been the place where the Devon county assizes were held as well. So Exeter Castle, which sits in a corner of the city walls, that belonged to the Crown. And so for many, many decades and decades before Exeter becomes its own county, there had always been the Devon assizes held in Exeter Castle. So there's a whole series of trials that take place in Exeter Castle, which are actually of Devon witches rather than specifically Exeter witches. And those continue to take place right throughout the period we've been discussing. And those are when the very last women in England that we know to have been condemned to death as witches and actually executed, that took place in Exeter Castle. So it's a separate jurisdiction from the Exeter Guildhall, which is dealing with cases from the county of Exeter, and the Exeter Castle is dealing with cases from the county of Devon. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Right.
So
Yeah.
this is where we get to the famous story of the Bideford witches. And again, there's a great book that's been recently produced by John Callow on their story, which is called The Last Witches of England. And that looks in depth at these three women, all from Bideford, who were accused, several of them on multiple occasions, of being witches. And they were eventually brought to the Exeter Assizes, held in the castle there in 1682, I believe. And they were condemned to death, and they were actually executed at Hevitree, which is the place of execution just outside the city and county of Exeter. And as far as we know, those are the very last three women who we can definitely show to have been executed as witches in England, and that's in 1682. And those would be the ones that your ancestors would have known, Josh. They're the ones with the real Bideford connection. But there is one final story which is really tantalizing about these Devon witches, which, if I may, I'll introduce here.
Great.
So this is the story of Alice Molland, and this is what I've been very interested in lately. So the three Bideford witches, these North Devon women, we know a lot about them. And lots of great scholars have done lots of work on them. And Callow's recent book has found a lot more evidence about them as well. But there's another woman who, there is one record, which is the Western Assizes Jail Book, I think it's called. And that notes that 3 years after the Bideford witches were definitely executed, another woman called Alice Molland was condemned to death as a witch at the Devon Assizes and condemned to be executed. And there's a little star written in the margin to show that the sentence of death had been passed on her. Now, she is always considered to have been the last witch to have been executed in the whole of England. But the weird thing is, there is not a single other piece of evidence about this woman apart from that one record in the trial book. So historians have always been interested in Alice, and lots of people have tried to find out more about her, but we've all been stymied. We've never been able to find out more about this woman. And I've always been fascinated by her because it's a local name. I've always known about her sort of growing up. And while I was conducting my own research in the Exeter records, I suddenly came across a woman called Avis Molland, Avis. And in the very same year that Alice Molland is said to have been executed, this woman, Avis Molland, came before the Exeter Justice of the Peace on a quite unrelated matter. Now, such a strange coincidence. Molland is not a typical name in Exeter. No one's ever been able to work out who Alice Molland was. And it suddenly occurred to me, could these two women be one and the same? is it possible that Avis Molland, who's definitely an Exeter woman, was actually the Alice who was condemned to death as a witch, but that she was reprieved thereafter and survived? Now, I can't prove this is the case, but what I have been able to do is to find out lots of information about Avis Molland. She was a poor Exeter woman whose husband died and left her a widow. She was in trouble with the authorities on sort of theft. She was very poor. She sort of fits the classic profile of a witch. She's active in Exeter in 1685, which is the year that Alice Molland was condemned to death. And fascinatingly, I found that Avis was still alive after that time, and I've actually found that she was buried in the 1690s in a suburban Exeter graveyard. Now, is it possible that Alice and Avis were one and the same? I don't think we're ever going to know for sure, but I've been really tantalised by that. And I think it's at least possible that the last witch executed in England was actually an Exeter woman who survived. I'm sort of still carrying out work to see if I can finally come to a definite answer on this.
Would that mean then that the Bideford witches were the last to be hanged?
It would, because, in their case, we don't only have the evidence that, of the jail book, which gives their sentence, but we also have loads of documents about their early life. We've got records of their conviction or their trial as witches on earlier occasions. And there's also several pamphlets that were produced after their death, because by this time the execution of a witch was becoming quite unusual. So, several pamphlets were published about this to take the news to the bigger public. And as Callow himself pointed out in his book, it seems very odd that if Alice Molland really was executed in 1685, why wasn't there a pamphlet about her? Why is there no other evidence about her? It's a very, very puzzling and intriguing case. You can see I've been really sort of puzzled and intrigued by it for years.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The names, that is a real puzzle when you're researching a person.
Yeah.
The way that they're spelled or what they go by, it often comes down to who was recording.
Yeah, exactly.
They hear the name. Yeah.
Spellings are all over the place. They're often done in a sort of phonetic way that, what it sounded like to the person at the time. So most of my Exeter witches, their names are spelt differently in different places. I mean, one of the very first women, in fact, the first woman that we know to be condemned to death at Exeter for a witch that we think was executed was a woman called Matilda Park, but she was often referred to as Maud Park, and they would use both names, Matilda and Maud, interchangeably, which is very confusing.
Yeah. The first woman that we know was hanged in the New England colonies was in Connecticut. Her name was Alice. Her name was Alice Young. That was 1647.
Really? Yeah.
But her name is all we have. So reading about Alice, your Alice, it really made me think of our Alice, because there's almost no story there. At first, only the date of her hanging was known for a century at least. And later it was revealed what her name was by somebody else's notation. But filling in the blanks that has been a motivation for scholars and authors. Like, we have to know who she is, but we just really don't. And her name was spelled sometimes Alse, A-L-S-E, and then other times Alice. Now, mostly we refer to her as Alice, but yeah, that's interesting. The two bookends, both were Alice's, they're mysteries.
Yeah. And I do think that, I always think of what I'm doing. I say to my students, what I'm doing in the archives is a kind of witch hunting, but it's in a different sense. It's to find out more about these women and to recover their stories. Almost all of mine are women, but there are some men as well. But I think because most of them are poor and elderly and female, they're the hardest people to get at in the records. So, it does take an awful lot of work to kind of get onto their trail and track them down. But it's so exciting, I think, to be able to sort of tell a bit of their story and say something about the people that they really were, rather than just being a name on a court book or perhaps on a monument today. One of the things I love doing about Avis Molland, as a very obscure Exeter woman, was just being able to retrace the story of this woman. I was able to find out when she was married, where she lived, who her children were, what her husband's name was, when they were tried for apparently trying to steal tobacco from someone else, and just being able to resurrect a very obscure individual from the past is really exciting in itself, even if they don't turn out to be England's last executed witch. But obviously if they were, that's more exciting still. And I mean, also, I love the fact that if she was Alice Molland, she escaped. She wasn't executed, in fact.
Yeah, we find it so valuable and so important to tell those stories.
Exactly.
And try to draw out the details that we can.
Yeah.
Are there any other stories that you wanted to tell? Any
Well,
who you think should be talked about?
I mean, I could bore you to death. There are so many stories there that I'd like to share. But I mean, I think one that is worth talking about, just coming out to something I said a few minutes ago, is that there are some male witches as well. I mean, obviously in Exeter, as everywhere else, the majority of the people who were accused of being witches were women. And as far as I can tell, most of them were either old or middle-aged. I've only found one example of a young woman in Exeter being accused of being a witch, but there are several men, interestingly enough. And one of the very few people who was actually executed was a man called Richard Wilkins. And again, he fits the stereotype in that he was clearly elderly, poor. I think he may have lived in St Sidwell's in one time, and not long after that, he moved to another suburban parish right beside it called Holy Trinity. There was a lot of movement between those two because they were both poor extramural parishes. And Wilkins is interesting because he arouses a lot of suspicion. He's accused much earlier of bewitching to death people and animals, but he gets off on that charge. But eventually, a few years later, he is actually accused again, brought before the court, and this time they decide that the evidence is overwhelming and that they must convict him, and he is duly executed in 1610. And as far as I know, that's the only man who was ever executed for witchcraft, not just in Exeter, but in the whole of the Southwest. Actually, that was another thing that I meant to mention to you both, that I'm sure you're aware of the fact the great majority of English witchcraft cases take place in the southeast of England. And Essex in particular is the most witch-ridden county in the whole of England. For a long time, it was thought that the witch terror, as they used to call it, only came to the West Country very late. And there were lots of sort of claims that these accusations of witches only began to be brought in the 1640s and 50s. One of the things I'm really proud about of my research in Exeter is showing that that's not true. And in fact, we get people being accused of witchcraft and condemned by the Exeter court to death as early as the 1560s. And the first woman we can absolutely prove was not just condemned to death as a witch, but actually executed, was a woman called Thomasine Short. And she was executed in Exeter in 1581. And at the moment, that's still the earliest definite witch case of an execution of a witch that we can prove in the whole of the Southwest. I think it's likely the two women who were condemned to death in the 1560s were executed as well. But in the case of Thomasine Short, we actually have the record of her execution as well as her condemnation. So we know for certain that she was executed. I mean, she's a really interesting case as well. I don't know if you guys have done any work on the concept of the scold.
We haven't actually. We'd love to hear more.
Well, the idea of the scold is essentially this is a very turbulent, disruptive, quarrelsome, loud person who basically creates problems for their neighbours. And during the medieval and beginning of the early modern period, it was possible for both men and women to be accused of being scolds, but the vast majority of people who are punished for this offence are women. And interestingly, the proportions are very much the same as for witchcraft. It's roughly 90% of scolds are women, just as 90% of witches are women. And there's an interesting progression that in a number of cases, people, or women usually, who are accused of being scolds will quite often go on to be accused of being witches as well. And this was absolutely the case in relation to Thomasine Short. So she's got a very interesting sort of track record. She first becomes before the Justice of the Peace in the 1560s. She's accused of being a maintainer of prostitutes. You won't be surprised to hear that she lives in St Sidwell's once again, like so many of these witches. Later, she's actually accused and found guilty of being a scold. And together with 4 other women, she is dragged through the River Exe at the stern of a boat as a punishment for her scolding. And what I found particularly interesting about this is the place they decide to carry out this punishment is actually just beside the place by the river where all the women of Exeter did their washing. So the idea was that these 5 women were punished for being scolds at the very place where the women of Exeter most often congregated. So it's showing how much this is a gendered punishment, and it's designed specifically to speak to women. And I thought it was absolutely intriguing to find that this woman, who'd already crossed swords with the city authorities on several occasions before for sexual crimes, for scolding, for robbery, it's she who's actually brought before them accused of murdering a whole family by witchcraft and executed in 1581. So there's a very interesting story there of her gradual sort of the rake's progress, as they would have seen it, from sexual crimes to actually being executed as a witch.
Wow.
That's so fascinating about the scolds. We did interview a gentleman about a case in Virginia a while back, and he told us that in Virginia there was this practice of dunking the women into the river if they spoke back against their husbands or something.
It's the classic punishment of a scold is to be dunked into water. In England, we had this thing called the cucking stool. And so the offender, whether male or female, but usually female, would be placed in this chair, and the chair it's like a seesaw. The chair will then be dunked 2 or 3 times in the water. And the idea is essentially to humiliate the person, that the neighbours will come and watch. The person will be dunked in the water vigorously several times, but it can also be done by being thrown into a river, being thrown into a pond. There are different ways of doing it. In Southampton, which is where my own university is based, they used to take the scolds of Southampton and put them in a half barrel, which would then be dunked into the sea down by the quay. So there are different ways of doing this, but it's really interesting to hear that it's crossed the Atlantic to the States and the same punishment was used there.
And once somebody's labeled a scold, convicted of being a scold, are they just a scold, or is that something they would move on from?
The threat of being ducked as a scold was often enough to cure this. So in some communities, they will actually trundle this cucking stool around the town, and they will say, if you carry on scolding, we'll put the cucking stool outside your door to show that you're a scold. And then if you keep doing it, we will actually dunk you. Yeah. So that's one way of doing things. And some of these women, and occasionally men who are ducked, that seems to have done the trick, and you don't see them again. But a lot of them are actually repeat offenders, and you see them being accused of scolding, fighting in the streets on a number of occasions. Some of these people are clearly just troublemakers who cause problems for their neighbours, but others may have been seen in a darker light as being potential criminals and belonging to sort of criminal subclass, if you like.
Yeah.
But obviously, in an age where they can hand out really harsh punishments, where many people are executed, being dunked in the water is very unpleasant, but it's a relatively minor punishment compared with being, lashed at a post or hanged.
Yeah.
Right. Definitely. Yeah. Reading your work, one of the questions that came to us was, were the accused in Exeter, did the prosecution try to get confessions from them?
Yeah, well, they did, but in a very sort of, how can I put it, in a kind of English way, because as I'm sure you know, you could not use torture in England. So witches could be interrogated, they could be cross-examined, they were often treated badly, kept in bad conditions. The prison was probably so horrible you'd almost say anything to get out of it. But no, torture was not to be employed, and there is no evidence whatsoever that torture ever was employed in Exeter. So the kind of practices that Matthew Hopkins used in the sort of the great English witch hunt, there's no evidence of those being used here in Exeter. What we do have evidence from this city is actually other people, other members of the community, using quite harsh techniques to try and break a witch's spell or to prove that someone was a witch. So I'm sure you're both familiar with the concept of scratching, that if you scratch a witch and draw her blood, that her spells will lose their effect. And there are several examples of people actually employing that kind of counter magic in Exeter against alleged witches. So that's the kind of the bodily violence that we see being done to witches in Exeter. But this is very much by their neighbours rather than by the magistrates and the forces of law and order.
Yeah, the details on the counter magic that they were talking about were very interesting details.
Yeah. I mean, one thing just to jump back, you asked, are there actually any examples of magistrates who really do seem to have wanted to push for the prosecution of witches? And there is just one example that I would share with you. So the most dominant figure in the history of Exeter between about 1600 and the Civil War was a man called Ignatius Jourdain. And he was a godly Puritan. He was obviously an extremely charismatic and frightening figure. He was at the sort of the head of this campaign to churn Exeter into a sort of a godly city on a hill. He had very interesting links with Dorchester and with the people who made their way to the New World. So there are lots of links there with him. He's a fascinating character. He does seem to have actually, partly just through the force of his own personality, transformed Exeter into this very godly city. Now, we talked earlier about cunning men and cunning women. And in the earlier part of this, the period that I studied, there's no evidence of those sorts of people being actually accused of being witches in Exeter. But it's very interesting to note that in 1629, a number of women come to Ignatius Jourdain and tell him that an elderly woman in Exeter has actually been telling people where lost goods can be found. And I think a lot of magistrates would have ignored that and said, oh, this is a cunning woman, this isn't really black magic. But Jourdain is not the man to let it lie. And he actually summons more witnesses before him to hear more about this woman's activities. And that case is then brought to the quarter sessions, the next sitting of the quarter sessions court. And the woman, a woman called Christabel Robbins, is actually indicted as a witch and tried. And it seems to be that Jourdain is actually pushing this on. And going back to Tabitha Stanmore's book, that's a very rare thing to happen to a cunning woman. And so the jury decide that there is a case to answer, and she's indicted, and it's decided that she will stand trial at the next sessions. But in the interim, fascinatingly, somebody gets word of this to London, and one of Charles I's officers sends down an order to Exeter saying, this woman is not to be tried in Exeter. This case is to be overseen by us in London. And so they say, send us all the details of this case. You're not to try it. And we don't know exactly what happened next, but it looks as if Christabel escaped and that Jourdain was foiled. And I think that's a really interesting example of the king himself, or at least one of his high officials, intervening to try and step in and perhaps quash a Puritan prosecution of a witch in Exeter.
A huge thank you to Professor Mark Stoyle for joining us today and sharing his significant research on these English witch trials.
Listeners, thank you so much for your curiosity, support, and dedication to these histories.
We have 2 events next month, August 2026, in New England, and we hope you can come out and say hi.
We'll be presenting at History Camp Boston on August 8th, time to be determined. The event will be running from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. at Suffolk University Law School in Boston, Massachusetts. So we look forward to seeing you there. There will be dozens of great talks given that day. So register today at historycamp.org. That's again, historycamp.org. They are selling out quickly. We'll also be at Connecticut Witch and Culture Fest in Hartford on August 9th. That's the Sunday. But we'll have a booth there both days that volunteers from In Witch Hunts and the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project will be hosting a booth where you can come and get history information, talk to us about the trials or the exoneration of those who were indicted for witchcraft. And at Connecticut Witch and Culture Fest, each day at 2:30 p.m., there will be a remembrance ceremony to honor those victims of the Connecticut witch trials. So we look forward to seeing you there as well.
And we often mention our special merchandise that's in our Zazzle shop that you can support the nonprofit with. But due to this special Connecticut event, we have a limited edition t-shirt for the event, has 2026 on it, and that's available. You can order that now.
You'll find a link to that in our show notes. And have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.